Now, this is one of the harder bits. The question talks about state-owned, and then it talks about private enterprise. So private enterprise is individuals or family who own it, or it can be owned by a company. But the key thing really is just that it's not owned by the state or the community, because if it's community run, we generally wouldn't call it private enterprise because it would not be for profit. It might be, but that's rare. Generally, the best way to think about it is that it's owned by individuals, families, or companies, or the shareholders, the people who own a stake in the business. It's almost always run on a profit motive, or essentially the profit motive to make a profit, and then if there are investors, to pay them what's called dividends or shares. But basically, the main thing there is that private enterprises want to make money for the people who own or invest in those businesses. Whereas you can think about cooperatives. You don't need to at all, because the question doesn't directly ask about them. But just bear in mind that there are things that are not quite private enterprise and not quite owned by the state. Okay, so cooperatives might be owned by the employees, where profit is reinvested in the company. It's not kind of taken out by an owner or something like that. They do exist in agriculture and food production, but you don't need to worry about them. And then state-owned is just the state own them. Generally, the government of the day will have some control over them. So in terms of schools, again, we're going to come back to this in lecture 3, but remember that there are some schools that are not just state-owned, or that obviously there are private schools where, you know, parents pay fees, but there are some other schools that are a bit more complicated, and we'll talk a bit more about these in lecture 3. But some examples is academy schools in the UK, which are similar to charter schools in the US. They're sort of based on each other. And basically they do get money from the government, but they're operated independently of government control. And they're often set up by universities or groups of parents, or religious organizations. And the point of them is basically because some people think that having more choice and more freedom in what schools teach their students is a good thing. So there are, remember that schools are slightly more complicated than just fee paying or not fee paying. So we'll come back to this lots, so don't worry that we're moving quite fast. But what these new types of schools, they tell us, so they tell us that choice and flexibility is valued. Yeah, so parents often like being able to choose different types of school. But then that's also important in food consumption, that people want choice over the food. But then maybe that's increasingly happening in education, and that's something we'll look at. We'll look at this question of choice quite a lot. But then on the other hand, with education, the government do regulate what schools teach and what food we consume. So even if something seems fully private, like food, the government still very heavily control what food we can eat and the standards to which food is produced. And they do that to ensure safety and quality. So we might want to think about that as well, because it might be the case that schools are owned by the government, so that the government can have more control, direct control, that children are not being taught stuff that the state thinks is a bad idea. So yeah, remember that both are sort of regulated by governments.